Hey guys, I'm JC and today we're playing Azami Lady of Scrolls. This deck looks to play wizards, draw cards, and then weaponize both to take out its opponents. If you enjoy the deck, make sure to stop by the channel where we have a deck tech discussing all of the included cards as well as the overall strategy. Let's see just how powerful drawing cards really is. Alrighty guys, let's see who we're playing today. We have Najeela the Blade Blossom, we have Lord Wingrace, and finally we have Atraxa Praetor's Voice. Alright, three very powerful commanders there, that's for sure. Let's see how Azami stacks up. Now if we take a look at our opening hand, we have quite a few lands. We do have ramp and we have a really great board wipe there, which I normally wouldn't keep this hand, but we may need to just with how fast Najeela can actually snowball. So let's keep this hand and see how we do. Atraxa starts us off by playing a land for turn. They have it come into play untapped, so they lose 2 life. And now they cast an Opt. Scry 1 and draw a card. And that is it for their turn. We draw an Offer You Can't Refuse for turn. Well, that is good, more interaction. So let's start by playing Manamo, and then we'll just pass it to our opponents. Najeela starts off by playing a land for turn. They crack it straight away. And they just put a tap land into play. And that is it for Najeela. Lord Wingrace plays a land for turn. They just have it come into play tapped, and they pass it over to Atraxa. Atraxa plays a tap land for turn, and that is going to be it for them. We draw Misdirection for turn. That's a nice ace up the sleeve to have for us. Let's play our island for turn. Let's get down our Deranged Assistant. From here, we'll just pass it to our opponents. Najeela plays a land for turn. They are just going to leave it there, having 2 mana open. So it's always hard to say with the Najeela deck how interactive it is. Usually the more competitive versions of it run a lot more interaction, so I guess we'll soon see as the game progresses. Lord Wingrace plays a tap land for turn, and that is it for them. Atraxa plays a land. Next they cast a Mana Crypt, and after that they cast Tamiyo Field Researcher. +1, choose up to 2 target creatures until your next turn. Whenever either of those creatures deals combat damage, draw a card. It's -2, tap up to 2 target non-land permanents. They don't untap during their controller's next untap step, which it looks like they're actually activating right now, unfortunately on our Deranged Assistant. And -7, draw 3, you get an emblem with, you may cast spells from her hand without paying their mana costs. Well, we'll have to try to make sure we keep that Planeswalker off that ultimate, because that's quite dangerous. And that is it for their turn. We draw an Ominous Seas for turn. Oh, and I just realized, sorry, I was incorrect. They actually upticked Tamiyo there. Let's start by playing our island for turn, because we will have to get enough islands down to activate Spectral Deluge to its best effect. And then what we'll do is we'll start by casting our Ominous Seas. We mill ourselves a High Tide there. And then we're going to foretell that Spectral Deluge. And that's going to be us for turn. Najeela plays a land. Now they cast Risen Reef. Whenever Risen Reef or another elemental ETB is under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't put the card onto the battlefield, put it into your hand. So it's ETB triggers. It looks like they don't find a land, so they put the card straight into their hand. And that's it for them. Lord Wingrace plays a land for turn. Now they start by casting Exploration. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. They play another land, a Wasteland. But it looks like they're just leaving it there. Mana Crypt triggers on Atraxa's upkeep. They lose the flip, so they take 3 damage. Now they play a land for turn. And now they cast their commander Atraxa. Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, and Lifelink at the beginning of your end step proliferate. Now they activate Tamiyo, targeting their commander and the Risen Reef. Then they move to their end step, Atraxa triggers. So now they're going to proliferate their Tamiyo. Which does mean next turn they're going to be able to get that ultimate, which is going to be a big problem for the rest of the table. And that's their turn done. We draw a Docent of Perfection for turn. That draw also triggers Ominous Seas. So let's play our island for turn. And I think we just have to do the best we can here to catch up and hopefully help the rest of the table slow down the Atraxa player. Let's get our commander on board, start drawing some more cards. That goes through. Let's pass the turn over. Najeela plays a tap land for turn. Now they cast the Ristic Study. Alright, well that should keep their hand nice and full. Now they move to combat. Do they swing in with their Risen Reef? They decide not to, and they just move to their end step. So it looks like now we move to the Lord Wingrace player's turn. They play a land for turn, an Urborg. Then they follow that up with a Cabal Coffers. Perfect pairing right there. So they're going to have good access to a lot of mana. They first start by casting a Wheel of Fortune that does trigger Rhystic Study. To be honest, I'm not really a big fan of that play if they don't have an answer to the Planeswalker, because whatever cards Atraxa draws into, they're going to be able to play for free next turn. They might be doing this to hunt for an answer, but it is very, very risky. On the plus side, it does trigger our Ominous Seas. We do draw into some decent cards there. The Galecaster Colossus in particular, once we get the mana to be able to cast it, is going to be able to take care of some of these problems. Next, they cast a Demonic Tutor that triggers Rhystic Study once again. And they don't pay. And after that, they cast an Assassin's Trophy targeting the Tamiyo. Well, that's really good news there. That does trigger Rhystic Study. Will they pay for it this time? And they do. So that's going to take care of Tamiyo, unless of course Atraxa has an answer, and they don't. So the table can definitely breathe a sigh of relief, at least for the moment. So I guess overall in that exchange, we actually came out pretty good just because our Ominous Seas has buffed up. And finally, they finish up by casting an Amulet of Vigor that triggers Rhystic Study, but they won't be able to pay, so Najeela draws once again. Whenever a permanent enters the battlefield tapped and under your control, untap it. And that is going to be it for them. Mana Crypt triggers on Atraxa's upkeep. They lose the flip once again, taking 3 damage. Now they just move straight to combat. Atraxa goes towards the Lord Wingrace player, as we probably expected. They take the damage. In their second main phase, they play a land for turn. And now they cast their own Rhystic Study. That triggers Najeela's Rhystic Study. And it looks like they are paying here. Well, we don't have anything to say about that. So that does go through. And then they cast a Kiora the Crushing that triggers Rhystic Study. It looks like they won't be able to pay. +1 until your next turn, prevent all damage that would be dealt to and dealt by target permanent and opponent controls. -1, draw a card, you may play an additional land this turn. And -5, you get an emblem with, at the beginning of your end step, create a 9/9 blue Kraken creature token. They use Kiora's down tick ability to draw a card and possibly play an additional land, which they do. They put a forest into play. Now they move to their end step, Atraxa does trigger. We're going to respond here. We're going to start by activating Azami. We get ourselves another land. And then we're also going to activate our Ominous Seas. Let's unleash the Kraken. Big 8/8 hits the board. And now Atraxa can proliferate. They just target their single Planeswalker with that. And now we move to our turn. We draw for turn, which triggers our Ominous Seas, putting a counter on it. And we also get a Lighthouse Chronologist there. That's a really nice find. Let's start by playing our land for turn. Put our island into play. Next, let's move to combat. And we'll see if we can take out that Planeswalker. Looks like Atraxa decides not to block here. So Kiora goes down. Next, we're going to cast our Sapphire Medallion. That's going to trigger both Rhystic Studies. We are going to pay for both. And after that, we're going to play our Lighthouse Chronologist. I normally wouldn't play this early because it does make us a little bit of a threat, but with the other things that are happening on the board at the moment, I think we might be able to sneak him under the radar just a little bit. That's going to trigger both Rhystic Studies once again. We're not going to pay here. And that's going to be us done for turn. Najeela plays a land. Now they start by casting Dockside Extortionist. That should net them a good amount of treasures. That triggers Rhystic Study. And they do decide to pay. When Dockside ETBs, it makes 6 treasure tokens. A good amount of mana for all the cards in their hand. Next, they cast Reconnaissance. That triggers Rhystic Study. They pay once again. So it's nice to see we have some responsible players over on the other side of the table. Next, they cast Ignoble Hierarch. That triggers Rhystic Study. This time they don't pay. And finally, they cast a Smothering Tithe. That does trigger Rhystic Study. Let's see if they pay for this one. And they don't. Alright, well in response, we're going to draw some cards here just so our opponent doesn't gain all that benefit off Smothering Tithe. So let's start activating Azami. Our first draw gets us an Arcane Signet. Also buffs up Ominous Seas. Let's tap the Deranged Assistant. Oh, Teferi Temporal Pilgrim. That's a nice draw. And finally, we'll tap our Chronologist. And that gives us an Archaeomancer. That's actually a really good hit as well. And after that, it looks like Smothering Tithe is going to resolve. But that is it for the Najeela player. On Lord Wingrace's draw step, Smothering Tithe triggers. They don't pay. Now they start by casting Rampage in Balos. That triggers Rhystic Study twice. They don't pay for the first one. That triggers Smothering Tithe. They won't be able to pay, so Najeela makes a treasure token. Rampage in Balos has Trample and Landfall. Whenever a land ETB is under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token. Now they play a land for turn of Vesuva. Let's see what it comes in as a copy of. Maybe they're Cabal Coffers to give them even more mana. And it is. That's going to trigger Rampage in Balos and Amulet of Vigor, so it will untap now. And then they're going to make a 4/4 beast. They play another land for turn, a Thespian Stage, that triggers Rampage in Balos. And I think our Lord Wingrace player here is going to be having a lot of Cabal coffers on the battlefield. Now they do activate their Thespian Stage. It actually becomes a copy of Jetmir's Garden, surprisingly. Really thought we would have seen the third Cabal coffers come down there. And that is going to be it for them. Mana Crypt triggers on Atraxa's upkeep. They lose the flip, taking 3 damage. Now Atraxa starts by casting Anguished Unmaking on the Smothering Tithe. That will trigger their Rhystic Study. And it looks like they are deciding to pay for it here. Oh, but do we have a response from the Najeela player? And they cast an Offer You Can't Refuse, which does trigger the Rhystic Study of the Atraxa player. Unfortunately, we can't join in on the interaction party here at the moment. We haven't really drawn into any of our interaction. So it's between both of those players at the moment. They do decide to pay for the Rhystic Study trigger. Offer does resolve, giving Atraxa 2 treasure tokens. And they do pay for the Rhystic Study trigger. Now that draw will actually trigger their Smothering Tithe. So they make another treasure token yet again. Next, Atraxa casts Nissa Vastwood, that triggers the Rhystic Study of the Najeela player. Nissa says, when she ETBs, you may search your library for a basic forest card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Whenever a land ETB is under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, exile her, then return to the battlefield transformed. And she becomes Nissa Sage Animist. And she also has +1, reveal the top card of your library if it's a land card, put it on the battlefield, otherwise put it into your hand. -2, create a Shire, a 4/4 green elemental. And -7, untap up to 6 target lands, they become 6/6s, they're still lands. Now they uptick Nissa. And it looks like they did reveal a land there. They do crack that land straight away. And now they cast Azami, Mentor of Heroes, that triggers Rhystic Study. They do pay. +1, distribute 3 1/1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures you control. The other +1, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an aura, creature, or planeswalker card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. And its ultimate is you gain 100 life. Now it looks like they're doing the second uptick ability. Looking at the top 4. Let's see what they reveal here. And they just find themselves a Solemn Simulacrum. Now they move to combat. Atraxa's coming our way. We'll have to take the damage. On the end step, Atraxa does trigger. So now they're going to proliferate both their planeswalkers. And now we go to our turn. And I've got to say, it's getting pretty crazy out there, so we really need to have a big turn now, I think, if we're going to have a chance of being able to take this game. Let's see what we draw first. We draw ourselves a Thran Dynamo. That's going to trigger Smothering Tithe and our Ominous Seas. We're not actually going to pay for Smothering Tithe here. Now we will start by playing our land for turn. And for some reason there, we actually have the Atraxa player scooping up. I don't know why that's the case. So I think this turn we'll start by getting down our Thran Dynamo. That's going to trigger Rhystic Study. We won't pay. Then we're actually going to draw with our Wizards here. Get ourselves an Archmage Emeritus. That does trigger Smothering Tithe. We won't pay. Next, we're going to cast our Teferi. That triggers Rhystic Study, but we won't pay again, unfortunately. Now we're going to activate Teferi, making a Spirit. Then we'll cast our Arcane Signet. This really does hurt not paying for the Rhystic Study triggers, but our opponents are just getting too far ahead of us at the moment. But if that Dockside sticks around and we can get to our next turn, being able to use Rite of Replication on it, hopefully with some protection, should really be able to set us up to get pretty far ahead. So we'll hold our Kraken back on defense. We're just going to pass the turn from here. Najeela starts by playing Impact Tremors. Whenever a creature ETBs under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Next, they cast their Commander Najeela. Whenever a warrior attacks, you may have its controller create a 1/1 white warrior creature token that's tapped and attacking. And for Wooburg, you can activate it to untap all attacking creatures. They gain Trample, Lifelink, and Haste until end of turn. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase, activate only during combat. That triggers Impact Tremors, so we each take a damage. Now they play a land for turn. Next, they cast Skull Clamp. Whenever a quick creature dies, draw 2 cards. So Najeela's setting themselves up to be quite dangerous here. All that's saving us at the moment is they don't have access to haste with Najeela. After that, they cast Sylvan Library. At the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life, or put the card on top of your library. And next, they cast Avacyn's Pilgrim. That triggers Impact Tremors once again. Now they move to equip their Skull Clamp to their Risen Reef. That dies and draws them 2 cards. And that is it for their turn. Lord Wingrace's draw step, Smothering Tithe triggers. They don't pay. Now they start by casting their commander, Lord Wingrace. That triggers Rhystic Study. And they do decide to pay. Lord Wingrace has +2, discard a card, then draw a card. If a land card is discarded this way, draw an additional card. -3, return up to 2 target lands from your graveyard to the battlefield. And -11, destroy up to 6 target non-land permanents, then create 6 2/2 green cat warrior creature tokens with Forest Walk. And now they decide to use its uptick ability. They discard an Anger in their graveyard, so now their creatures do have haste. That triggers Smothering Tithe. Now they play a land for turn, that triggers their Rampage and Balos. And now they cast Ugin the Spirit Dragon, that does trigger Rhystic Study. And we are actually going to respond here because it's very likely that they're going to wipe our entire board. So let's start by drawing a card with our Chronologist. That's going to trigger our opponent's Smothering Tithe as well as a bunch of our permanents. So we won't be able to pay for Smothering Tithe. We get another counter on Ominous Seas. Our Spirit gets a little bit bigger. Teferi also grows. We did draw an island there, unfortunately. Now we're going to cast our Dramatic Reversal. That triggers Rhystic Study, we won't be able to pay. And that actually causes the Lord Wingrace player to scoop. I'm not really sure why they scooped there. It's not like we were winning or anything. But the fact they did scoop there actually means it might help us really get far ahead of the game. I mean, again, the dockside isn't going to be as good here now that another player's scooped up, but it does mean our board stays intact. Now, unfortunately, what that also did actually do is it pushed us right to our turn. So we weren't even able to really take advantage of that. So again, we really see the effects there of what happens when players scoops. It really ends up messing with how the game plays out. Luckily, our triggers are still on the stack, however, so there is some consolation there. Now, Smothering Tithe does trigger. We won't pay. And looks like our opponent has responded by casting Boros Charm, trying to deal 4 damage to our Teferi. Well, that's not a problem at all. We should actually be able to buff up Teferi here. So let's respond now to that. We'll tap Azami. We'll draw ourselves a card. That puts more triggers on the stack, including another Smothering Tithe, which we won't pay for. So we'll see how much interaction our opponent has in their hand. So Teferi is going to gain a loyalty counter, which it does. Our Spirit is getting bigger here. Now we'll activate Azami again on the Chronologist, put in the same triggers on the stack. We won't pay for Tithe. Teferi moves out of lethal range, unless they have a response here. They don't. Our Spirit gets bigger. Now we could certainly counter the Boros Charm here, if they're worried about our Teferi growing too big. And I think we actually will here. And that will trigger their Rhystic Study. We won't pay. That gets countered. Now let's start by playing our land for turn. Now this next play we make is going to be one that's going to go all in. But I think, again, we have to try to copy this Dockside Extortionist, because if Najeela gets to their next turn, they're probably just going to win with the raw amount of combat damage they're going to put through. So let's just keep our fingers crossed and hope that it resolves. That triggers Rhystic Study. This time we will pay. And let's hope that it goes through. And it does. So we have a lot of triggers go on the stack. Let's see if our opponent cracks their treasures in response. It looks like they don't. So they're giving us access to all this mana. Now let's cast our Archaeomancer. That triggers Rhystic Study. We're going to pay, because now we can definitely afford to pay it. On ETB, we're going to return our Rite of Replication. That comes back to our hand. Now we're going to play our Galecaster Colossus. That triggers Rhystic Study, which we'll pay for. Now we're going to tap our Colossus to bounce the Smothering Tithe. We'll also bounce the Rhystic Study here using Archaeomancer. Now we'll play our Seagate Restoration. That puts a lot of triggers onto the stack. So now our Spirit's going to grow really big. We're going to get a lot of counters on Ominous Seas, and most importantly, Teferi is definitely going to grow pretty big as well. So now I will cast our Triskaidekaphile. And it looks like with that, our opponents actually conceded there. Yeah, I think they realized that with Teferi, we'd be able to bounce all their stuff, and it was going to be pretty hard for them to come back into the game. Well, that is the game done there, guys. Let's go to the review and discuss what happened. So before I discuss this game, I just want to give you guys a pre-warning in case you plan on playing this deck on Magic Online. There are a small number of players that really dislike playing against counterspells and control decks in general, so you will have those types of players conceding more often than you'd like. Just something to keep in mind. But with that out of the way, as for the game itself, it was getting pretty scary out there. Atraxa came close to ultimate in a very powerful Planeswalker, Lord Wingrace had all the mana they could have wanted, and Najeela was primed to win the game. Fortunately, we were able to keep our life total healthy and the wizards coming down, drawing more and more cards until eventually we could find an opening to go for the win, and did so. That's one of the great things about playing this deck. As the game goes longer, the card advantage you accrue becomes so great that winning the game becomes an eventuality as opposed to a possibility. Well, that's it for today's game. Although it was a shame that we had 2 opponents scoop, I still hope you enjoyed seeing all the card advantage that Azami accrues, as well as the way that we won that game with all those dock sides. Until next time, guys.